It was the last week of December, and the small county hospital looked like an island of white lights in a sea of snow. Sara Solomon, a 35-year-old surgeon, wore her hair in a tight bun and the serenity of someone who had learned to live under pressure. She was known for her surgical precision and almost unnerving calm. In the hallways, everyone said nothing could throw her off her game. She was married to Michael Darcy, her teenage sweetheart, a man who always knew how to use the right words and the smile that disarmed conflicts. In everyone's eyes, they were the perfect couple. He, attentive, she, brilliant. But behind that image, Sara bore the weight of almost all the bills and a routine that had become predictable, even in silence. That Christmas, Michael had told her in a soft voice that they couldn't travel to the lake house like every year because her father was feeling ill. "Take the guard shift, love. The hospital needs you," he had asked, kissing her on the forehead. Sara, accustomed to putting others before herself, agreed. She spent December 24th amid scalpels, cold lights, and the smell of disinfectant, with a small snowflake brooch pinned to her surgical scrubs, an almost childlike gesture that no one noticed. Outside, the world was celebrating, and she thought that was also what love meant, giving up without drama. But everything changed at 10:17 p.m., when a notification on her phone broke the monotony like an alarm. It was a photo. The lake house. The illuminated pine tree on the porch, Michael smiling next to a woman in a red coat and honey-brown hair. Sara's heart didn't react immediately. She just stared at the screen with the trained neutrality of someone who has seen lives snuffed out in a matter of seconds. In the lower corner of the image, her blue mug with the crest of Michael's university was recognizable, and on the porch railing hung a silver star, the one she had bought herself for their first Christmas as a married couple. The post, posted by the brother-in-law who never knew how to keep quiet, read, "Family reunited finally." 3 minutes later, it disappeared from the profile, deleted without a trace, as if nothing had happened. But Sara had already saved it. She didn't say a word. She didn't call anyone. She simply walked to the break room, looked at her reflection in the fogged-up mirror, and thought that silence could be a sharper weapon than a scalpel. Over the next few days, she continued working with the same professional coolness that had earned her respect at the hospital, but something had changed. The precision of her movements in the operating room had become a method for something else, understanding. She waited. She watched. She didn't mention the photo to Lisa, her friend on call, or to her husband. She just began taking mental notes, schedules, excuses, patterns. Michael came back later than usual, smelled of an unfamiliar perfume, and always found a reason not to have dinner together. That's when Sara decided that if she was going to uncover the truth, she'd do it her way. No scenes, no tears, just facts. And facts, she thought, are the only surgery that never lies. One night, while reviewing files in her office, she called Lisa, her closest friend from the nursing home. Lisa had that blend of irony and tenderness that hospital life eventually forges. She listened to the story without interrupting, and in a whisper said, "I have a contact who could help you. Not for revenge, to know for sure." That's how she met Private Detective Mark Delaney, a former police officer who now worked on infidelity and domestic fraud cases. Mark was meticulous, discreet, and had that weary look of someone who has seen too many ruins disguised as happy marriages. In a matter of days, he tracked movements, locations, and even hotel reservations. The report was as clear as a scalpel on raw skin. Michael had been in a relationship with Amanda Morrison, an office colleague, for 15 months. They were using the lake house as a hideout, a property Sara had renovated with her own savings. The discovery didn't make her scream or cry. On the contrary, her mind became surgical, calculating, almost cold. Sara spent an entire night in the kitchen, the file open and a cup of coffee without sugar in her hands. She reviewed every receipt, every invoice, every transfer. 90% of the expenses were in her name, all the renovations paid for from her account. She was the one financing the affair. That realization gave her more strength than anger. If all this belongs to me, I can also decide how it ends, she thought. She didn't need emotional revenge. She needed precision. So she began to plan the conclusion of her own story with the calm of someone preparing major surgery. First, without witnesses. Then, without remorse. The first step was legal, not emotional. Sara made an appointment with a lawyer specializing in property law. She arrived on time, carrying a briefcase full of documents and a face so controlled that the man assumed it was a business dispute. She explained everything without raising her voice. The transfers, the lake house, the double life. When she finished, the lawyer, a man with a grey beard and the patience of a watchmaker, told her something she would never forget. Emotions are like fire, doctor, but paperwork is like water that puts it out. That phrase became her mantra for the next few weeks. She began gathering evidence, recording conversations, documenting every shared expense. Meanwhile, Michael continued to portray the perfect husband, little imagining that his every smile was being filed as evidence. The second phase came right after, the silent strategy. Sara discreetly installed cameras in the lake house, replaced the locks, and incorporated an alarm system directly linked to the local police. Every move was calculated, measured, with no margin for error. Meanwhile, she feigned normalcy, even tenderness. They had dinner together, watched old series, talked about projects that would never be fulfilled. On the surface, she was still the self-sacrificing and reliable wife, the one who sacrificed days off for shifts, the one who didn't ask questions. But inside, something had been released, a certainty as serene as it was dangerous. She no longer needed to reveal anything. Now she just waited for the exact moment to lay it all out with the precision of a well-made incision. The opportunity came just before New Year's. Michael told her he'd spend the 31st at his parents' house, just a little while to be with them. Sara pretended to hesitate, but finally agreed. "I'll cover an extra shift in the ER," she replied matter-of-factly, her voice not even trembling. That night, she packed a small bag and went to Lisa's house, where she was waiting with red wine and a knowing silence. From her laptop, Sara connected to the lake house's camera system. The monitor showed snow falling on the porch, the flickering light of flashlights, and the interior tidy like a stage set. Everything was ready. At 9:06 p.m., the first cars pulled into the driveway. Michael, Amanda, and his family, laughing with the confidence of those who think they have the world under control. Sara observed every detail with an almost unreal serenity. Amanda, dressed in a beige coat, toasted with champagne. Michael placed logs in the fireplace, while his mother, excited, recorded a video for social media. No one imagined that this family gathering would be remembered for very different reasons. When the clock struck 11:49 p.m., one of the system's sensors was activated, registering the unauthorized entry. In less than 5 minutes, police sirens broke the silence of the woods. Michael stepped onto the porch, hands raised, confused, as officers entered with flashlights and warrants. Amanda tried to escape, but an officer stopped her. She had an outstanding warrant for assault. On the screen, Sara watched, without blinking. That was her way of toasting the new year. The scene unfolded like a carefully rehearsed script. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to emerge from their homes. Some filmed from a distance, others murmured Michael's name, recognizing him. The news spread before midnight. son of respected family arrested for trespassing. In the video broadcast by a local network, the sign at the entrance was clearly visible. Private property, Sara Solomon, MD. Every detail spoke for itself. When the police escorted Amanda to the patrol car, snow covered her tear and alcohol-stained face. Michael tried to explain something to the officers, but no one would listen. Everything was recorded: the dates, the changed keys, the legal warnings. Sara hadn't left a single loose end. From Lisa's house, the surgeon watched silently, without a drop of wine in her hand. She felt neither joy nor sadness, only a deep inner cleansing, as if she could finally breathe without anesthesia. Lisa looked at her silently, not daring to ask anything. The television was still on, showing the emergency lights and the snow-covered cars. In that instant, Sara understood that her revenge wasn't punishment, but liberation. She had turned pain into precision and silence into justice. When her phone began vibrating with desperate calls from the Darcy family, she simply placed it face down on the table. No one deserved an explanation that was already written with facts. The calls continued throughout the night, her mother-in-law crying, her brother-in-law pleading, even Michael himself on the police station phone. None of them got a response. Sara simply watched the sunrise through Lisa's apartment window. The grey sky was beginning to clear, and the snow was becoming almost transparent under the first rays of sunlight. In the reflection of the glass, her face seemed different, more serene, more aware of her own power. It was as if that night she had closed a 7-year cycle without shedding a single tear. "Happy New Year," she murmured without irony. She knew that, from that moment on, everything that came next would depend solely on her. In the following days, Sara acted with the same discipline she displays when conducting a complex surgery. She cancelled their joint credit cards, transferred their savings accounts, notified the bank of the separation of assets, and sent the divorce papers by registered mail to the in-laws' house, along with Michael's suitcases. Each step was executed with surgical precision, leaving no room for emotional chaos. When Michael finally called her from an unknown number, pleading with her to listen to him, she simply replied, "The lawyer will explain everything." Then she hung up. There was no anger, no relief, only the certainty of having completed a procedure that had been pending for too long. The scandal spread like wildfire across local networks. Videos of the arrest circulated, accompanied by sensational headlines. "Doctor arrested on New Year's Day after being caught trespassing." In the comments, it didn't take long for the family ties to be discovered, and soon the Darcy name became a topic of conversation in cafes and offices. Michael was suspended from his job, and Amanda, after being released on bail, attacked him in front of the cameras on the street. That scene sealed the end of the farce. The case became an example of poetic justice. The man who had lived by appearances was exposed, while the woman who had endured in silence regained her dignity without uttering a single word. Sara didn't seek attention or hide. She continued working at the hospital, greeting everyone with her usual calm. Some colleagues looked at her with curiosity, others with respect. She simply did her job and returned home without looking back. At night, instead of reviewing files, she allowed herself something new, true silence, without guilt. Sometimes she would sit by the river with a blanket and a cup of tea, listening to the ice crunching beneath the ducks. She needed no witnesses other than her own peace. That was her way of starting over, without revenge, without nostalgia, only with a serenity that no one could ever take away from her. Weeks passed, and each day felt like reconstruction surgery, slow, painstaking, but necessary. Sara rented a small apartment across the river and went back to using her maiden name, Solomon. Changing the name on her white coat was more symbolic than any court ruling. It was her way of remembering that life went on, but with new limits and priorities. She adopted a grey cat named Atlas, a silent companion who slept on her medical books. Little by little, order returned to hers. Not the rigid order she used to control chaos, but a more human, freer one. One afternoon, while reviewing the stored images from the security system, she thought about how ironic it all was. She had recorded the betrayal to protect herself, and now those same images served as a lesson in self-control. It was then that she decided to share her story anonymously on a forum of real experiences, not to show off, but to warn that emotional intelligence can be the most powerful weapon. And if you've also made it this far, tell me where you're listening to this story from. Sometimes knowing where in the world people are reading us reminds us that no one is alone when they decide to stand up. After writing those lines, she closed her laptop, poured some white wine, and felt that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't owe anyone any explanations. The post became unexpectedly popular. Dozens of women, and a few men, responded, sharing their own stories of deception and silent control. Sara read the comments at night, silently, feeling as though she'd created a kind of invisible web of mutual understanding. She didn't respond, she just watched. It was strange to feel so connected to strangers after years of living inside an emotional bubble. For the first time, she understood that pain could also be useful, that the experience that had nearly destroyed her could now be used to rebuild others. Meanwhile, Michael tried to negotiate a dignified exit with his lawyers, but everything was working against him. The press, the videos, the testimonies, nothing could be erased. His family, who had previously defended him tooth and nail, now avoided mentioning him in public. The same house where he had celebrated his betrayal was legally in Sara's name, and the courts upheld her absolute right to the property. It was then that she decided to sell the luxury car he boasted about so much and donate the money to a scholarship fund for young doctors, not out of altruism, but out of balance, transforming what had been a symbol of abuse into a tool for the future. The trial ended 3 months later in a brief but intense hearing. Michael arrived, his suit wrinkled and his gaze lost. When the judge read the ruling, her face collapsed like an old building. Having its scaffolding removed, Sara didn't look at him once. She just listened to the ruling, signed the documents, and left the courtroom without saying a word. Outside, a gust of wind lifted her grey coat and ruffled a lock of her hair. She didn't look like a victor, she looked like a woman at peace. Her lawyer offered her a hand in congratulations, but she smiled with that polite distance that only those who have learned not to celebrate the obvious possess. In the following days, the news faded like any scandal that ceases to be profitable for the media. Sara took refuge in routine and, for the first time, began to sleep more than 5 hours at a time. The nightmares gradually faded, and in their place emerged something different: curiosity. Curiosity about the empty spaces in her life, about the things she had stopped doing to please others. She began to paint, to walk along the seawall at sunset, to cook just for herself. She discovered that her solitude wasn't a punishment, but fertile ground where she could rebuild herself without anyone's permission. One April afternoon, while she was organizing some paperwork in her new apartment, the doorbell rang. At the door, a man with graying hair and a calm gaze smiled at her somewhat shyly. He introduced himself as James Moskoff, the new neighbor from the building next door. He was also a doctor, an orthopedic surgeon, and carried a discreet crutch in his right hand. During the conversation, she noticed a small metal pin on his jacket, a war veteran's badge. James spoke with a serenity that wasn't silent, but full of stories that didn't need shouting. He offered her help moving some boxes and, as he said goodbye, left her his number written on a prescription pad. It was the first human gesture that had touched her in a long time. Over the next few weeks, they began to cross paths frequently, in the elevator, at the hospital cafe, at the local convenience store. They didn't talk about their pasts. Brief glances and small talk were enough to build something new, without labels or expectations. Sara discovered that James had the same kind of calm she had learned to cultivate. The calm that doesn't seek to fill silence, but rather to share it. One night, as he told her a story about his service overseas, she realized she had found someone who had also learned to survive his own battlefield, even if the scenarios were different. The bond between them grew slowly, like a scar that heals well, because it's not forced. Sara didn't plan it or resist it. It just happened. James had a particular way of looking at the world, with that mixture of gratitude and weariness of someone who knows the cost of being alive. One night, while they shared a simple dinner with cheap wine and music in the background, he said something that left a mark on her. Not all who win battles come back unscathed. She understood then that she didn't need any more explanations about her past. They both bore scars, just in different places. From that night on, she began to sleep better. She no longer checked her phone before closing her eyes, nor waited for messages that wouldn't arrive. At the hospital, her performance improved markedly. The chief of surgery praised her for her focus and leadership, little imagining that behind that calm lay a rebirth. Sara agreed to participate in a mentoring program for young residents, and in one of the sessions she spoke, without naming names, about how self-control can be a form of dignity. Many listened in silence, with tears still in their eyes. When she finished, a resident said, "Thank you for showing us that you can lose everything without losing yourself." That phrase stayed with her for days. It was the most honest validation she had received in years, and it didn't come from romantic love, but from human admiration. Summer arrived with an air of renewal. Sara and James began to share small routines, early walks by the river, impromptu breakfasts on the sea terrace, conversations that stretched into midnight. There were no labels or promises, just presence. He, with his military background and his slow gait, had learned to value silence as much as she did. Sometimes, when the wind stirred the curtains and the golden light streamed through the window, she thought about how ironic it was to have found calm right after the chaos. It wasn't love that guided her yet, but mutual respect. That feeling of being next to someone who doesn't demand anything, who only accompanies. On one of those evenings, James told her about his work with veterans dealing with invisible trauma. Sara listened attentively, recognizing in his words the same compassion she tried to apply to her patients. "The hardest wounds to heal," he said, "are not on the skin, but in the guilt." She nodded without responding. In that instant, she understood that life, after all, didn't owe her explanations, only opportunities to move on. She took his hand, not as a romantic gesture, but as a silent pact between two survivors who somehow had found themselves at the same point on the emotional map. One Sunday morning, while they were drinking coffee on the terrace, James showed her a small wooden box he had brought from his time in the army. Inside were medals, photographs, and a letter written by his unit mate who had died on a tour of duty in the Middle East. Sara read it respectfully, in silence. The message spoke of loyalty, purpose, and learning to start over. Even when fear still weighs heavily, that letter moved her deeply because it reminded her of her own process, that process of trusting again, even when her body still trembled. From then on, she began to see the past, not as an open wound, but as a scar that no longer hurt, but only taught. That same week, she decided to return to the lake house. She hadn't been back since that New Year's Eve. She drove in silence, the cat asleep in the back seat. When she arrived, the air smelled of old wood and melting snow. The house was still the same, but it wasn't the same anymore. She opened the windows, let the light in, and walked the halls without rancor. In the kitchen, where lies had once been served, she placed fresh flowers. In the living room, she lit the fireplace and let the sound of the fire fill the empty space. It was her refuge now, not a reminder of betrayal, but proof that everything can be rebuilt if done calmly and with dignity. Sara spent the entire weekend at the lake house. She slept with the windows open, letting the forest breeze in with the smell of damp earth. Every corner seemed to tell a different story, but no longer burdened by grief. On Sunday morning, she wrote a letter to herself. It wasn't a list of goals or a farewell. It was an honest conversation. You didn't lose yourself, she wrote. You only reinvented yourself in the silence. She folded the sheet of paper and put it in a drawer along with the old house keys. That, she thought, was the symbol of her true victory, not having destroyed anything, only having learned to let go. When she returned to the city, everything seemed lighter. The work, the guard duty, even the traffic. Sometimes people greeted her on the street or at the hospital with admiration, vaguely remembering last winter's scandal. She responded kindly, but without explanation. She no longer needed to justify her story or correct others' versions. She had understood that everyone interprets ruins according to their own experience. At night, when insomnia tried to return, she looked at the moon's reflection on the river and remembered that phrase her lawyer had told her, "Paper puts out fire." But she had also discovered something deeper. Peace, when it comes, makes no sound. At the end of the summer, Sara was invited to a conference on medical ethics at the local university. She accepted, even though she had avoided the stage for years. In her presentation, she spoke about self-control as a tool for decision-making, not repression. Her speech was sober but honest. She recounted, without naming names, how she had learned more about human nature outside the operating room than inside. Sometimes, she said, the wounds we can't see teach us how to operate more precisely on the wounds we can heal. The audience erupted in applause, not for her eloquence, but for her authenticity. Many approached her afterward to thank her for putting into words what so many felt and didn't know how to explain. That night, when she returned home, she found a small envelope in her mailbox. It was from James. Inside was a photograph he'd taken, their reflection in the window of the cafe where they used to have breakfast. On the back, a brief note. In the end, surviving is finding beauty even in what hurt. Sara smiled, tucked the photo into an anatomy textbook she didn't often open anymore, and poured herself a glass of wine. She looked out the window and thought that life, when lived mindfully, has a strange way of rewarding resilience. Not with prizes or perfect romances, but with calm. A calm hard-earned, like a suture that finally heals properly. As the months passed, her bond with James strengthened naturally, without relying on promises or labels. There was trust, a sense of understanding, and above all, a silent respect. He invited her to reunions with former service colleagues, men and women who shared stories marked by loss and resilience. Sara listened attentively. She saw herself, reflected in them, even though their battles were different. She understood that war isn't always fought in trenches. Sometimes it happens in intimacy, in small decisions, in learning to say no when before everything was yes. That understanding brought her closer to James, but above all it brought her closer to herself. One weekend, they decided to go together to a retreat for veterans and medical personnel working with trauma. In that place, surrounded by pine trees and lakes, there was an almost sacred silence. During one of the activities, the participants shared something they had lost and something they had gained. When it was her turn, Sara said, "I lost the habit of waiting for others to validate my worth, and gained the ability to choose my peace above all else." There was a long, respectful silence. James, at her side, took her hand. She felt this was his way of toasting, not out of revenge or triumph, but out of balance. Autumn brought golden leaves and a different air, as if every corner of the city breathed renewal. Sara resumed the habit of writing, this time not to document pain, but to record what she had learned. She filled notebooks with reflections on control, loss, and rebirth. Her story, once a secret, began to circulate among medical students as an example of emotional intelligence in times of crisis. Some called her the doctor who planned her own freedom. She laughed when she heard this. She didn't see herself as a hero, just as someone who grew tired of surviving halfway and chose to live in peace. One rainy night, while James was cooking and the scent of rosemary filled the apartment, Sara reopened the forum where she had shared her story months before. She read it with distance, as if it were someone else's story. Then she closed the screen, poured herself a glass of wine, and went to help James set the table. The sound of rain against the glass was all they needed to know that the past had finally become something distant and benign. Over time, Sara's story stopped being a painful memory and transformed into a kind of internal compass. She no longer minded talking about the past, although she did so only when it could be helpful. In an interview with a medical publication, she mentioned that emotional intelligence should be taught as much as anatomy, because both save lives in different ways. Her tone wasn't one of revenge, but of maturity. She had learned that it's not always about winning or losing, but rather about deciding which parts of yourself deserve to be protected. That interview was shared thousands of times, and although she received messages of admiration, she never let herself be trapped by vanity. Hers wasn't about fame, it was about balance. On quiet days, Sara continued to visit the lake house. She kept it spotless, but no longer as a museum of the past, but as a living space. There she organized meetings with young doctors who were going through separations or family pressure, teaching them to remain steadfast without losing their humanity. On the walls, she had hung new photographs, landscapes, faces, sunrises. None of them showed sadness. It was as if each painting silently said, "This too passed, and I'm still here." One afternoon, as she watched the leaves fall into the water, she realized that her revenge was never meant to destroy, but to heal. And healing, she thought, is also a form of justice. In winter, the lake house was covered in snow again. Sara lit the fireplace and placed a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside, she kept her wedding ring, the detective's report, and an antique key, not as trophies, but as reminders. She sat in front of the fire with a blanket, the cat asleep on her lap. In the silence, she heard the wood creaking and felt a deep peace. She thought about everything she had lost, but also about what she had gained: self-respect, serenity, purpose. She no longer feared loneliness. She hugged it like a coat on a cold day, knowing it protected her without suffocating her. James arrived later with freshly baked bread and a bottle of wine. He didn't bring flowers or grand gestures, just presents. They shared dinner in silence, watching the flames reflect on the glass. At one point he looked at her and said, "You know what I admire about you, that you never needed to shout to be heard." She smiled. It was true. Her greatest triumph wasn't scandal or justice or exposure. It was having remained calm amidst the chaos. Because sometimes she understood the greatest strength is in control, not in explosion. On that quiet night she understood that love, if it returns, only makes sense when it no longer hurts. The following years passed without incident, and that for Sara was the greatest gift. She continued operating, teaching, and occasionally travelled with James to conferences or short mountain getaways. Eternities weren't promised, they were chosen each day, with the calm of those who had already known the price of chaos. On her desk, next to the surgical microscope, she kept a small, smooth, round stone from the lake. It was her silent amulet, a reminder that strength isn't always shouted, sometimes it's breathed. When young doctors asked her for advice, she always responded the same: don't try to take revenge quickly, try to understand yourself first. Clarity is the purest victory. One autumn afternoon, she received an unexpected letter. It came from the hospital where Michael had worked. It was a formal request for a reference, as he was looking for a job in another state. Sara read it twice and then laid it on the table. She felt neither anger nor pity. She wrote just a simple line: "I know your technical skills, but not your capacity for personal responsibility." She signed and sent it without further ado. As she sealed the envelope, she understood that such a small gesture was her final closure. She didn't need to erase the past. All she needed was to put an elegant end to it. When December arrived, Sara decided to celebrate the holidays at the lake house, this time without fear of the memories. She decorated the pine tree with white lights, played soft music, and prepared a simple dinner. As midnight approached, she stepped out onto the porch with a blanket and a glass of wine. The snow fell slowly, illuminated by the moon, and in the silence, the only sound she could hear was the crunch of the ice on the lake. She thought about how much had changed in a year. She was no longer the woman who needed to test loyalties, but someone who understood her own worth. That moment, so simple, was her true victory. She raised her glass to the sky and whispered, "To the calm after the storm." James arrived shortly after, wearing a ridiculous hat and a smile that melted the snow. He carried a small gift wrapped in brown paper. Upon opening it, Sara found a pendant shaped like a scalpel, tiny and silver. "So you never forget that control can also heal," he said. She hugged him wordlessly. The fireplace relit, and for the first time, Sara didn't feel emptiness or longing, only gratitude. She watched the flames reflect in his eyes and knew that life, with all its twists and turns, had given her back something more valuable than love, the ability to choose peace and stay there without asking permission. The following days were smooth, as if life had arranged not to disrupt her serenity. At the hospital, shifts passed without incident. Patients greeted her warmly, and her colleagues respected her not only for her skill, but for the calm with which she faced everything. Some said there was something different in her gaze, a mix of firmness and compassion. Sara didn't seek to understand it. She had simply learned to live without drama, accepting that stability can also be exciting if one has earned it. Every morning, before beginning surgeries, she ran her hand over the silver pendant James had given her. It was her silent ritual, her way of remembering that anything worthwhile takes time, patience, and courage. One night, while walking by the river, she stopped to look at her reflection in the water. The city lights flickered, and the wind blew with an almost human murmur. She remembered that December in the hospital, the notification on her phone, the image that had changed everything. She smiled without sadness. "Thank you," she murmured, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for having forced her to wake up. She understood that sometimes betrayal is just a brutal form of redirection, and in that simple thought she found solace. She walked home slowly as the snow began to fall again, as if the world insisted on washing away everything that had once hurt. Months later, Sara decided to write one last post on the forum where she had shared her story. It wasn't a continuation, but a closure. She titled the text, "When Silence Becomes Freedom." She recounted how calm had replaced the noise, how self-confidence had become her only compass. She didn't mention names, dates, or wounds, only lessons learned. In the first few hours, the post filled with comments, people from around the world thanking her for her words, sharing their own rebirths. She read them with a discreet smile and wrote a single response. "You don't need revenge to heal. Just stand firm until the pain loses its voice." Then she turned off the screen, took a deep breath, and looked out at the sunrise streaming through the window. Sara Solomon's story didn't end with a scandal or a new love, but with something deeper, the recovery of control over her own life. Her lake house was still standing, her white coat hung on the same coat rack every day, and her gaze, more serene than ever, reflected the peace of someone who has learned to choose her battles. As the sun gilded the horizon, she reflected that true justice doesn't always occur in the courts, but within the soul. She closed her eyes and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because finally everything was in order.